It's my nerd world. Welcome to it, a Star Wars podcast. On the show this week, Solo, a Star Wars story expected to continue on Disney+. Perhaps. Sounds like it's probably going to happen. I have details for you. Going to talk a little bit about why Palpatine made a great villain and why his return in The Rise of Skywalker really did wrap up all 9 movies nicely. We'll also get into movie scheduling and the impact that it has on the box office for the theatrical releases. I read an interesting quote that really kind of sparked a line of thinking that I wanted to share with you on the show this week. Plus, we have your listener feedback. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Remember, you can go to mynerdworld.net to find out all things about My Nerd World, whether it is the podcasts. There's a brand new space opera podcast in the works. Details are available at mynerdworld.net. Also, my Depeche Mode podcast, and all things about EMBARK, the series, the science fiction space opera novels that I write. Book 4 is on the way. Book 5 is being written right now. And giveaways are taking place on the website, including free audiobooks. So go to mynerdworld.net and check it all out. Right now, let's go ahead and get to the show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
You know, I had a bit of a revelation listening to the classic intro to My Nerd World, the Star Wars podcast. I am your host, Jon Justice, and before we dive headlong into the show, I just want to say that wherever you are right now, I hope you are happy, and I hope you're healthy, and I hope this show can serve as a distraction from everything that's going on in the world right now. In the show this week, we're going to talk a little bit about box office returns and the impact that overlapping content, Star Wars content, might have on box office releases and the impact that it may have had already. I read a particular line in an article as of late that got me thinking, got a train of thought going about the marketing of Star Wars and the reasons why Solo, Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker performed the way that they did. So I'll share that with you in the later part of the show. But in relation to that, listening to the opening intro, I pulled the majority of that audio from one of the main trailers for The Force Awakens. And there's a version of Han and Leia's theme that was made for the trailer in and of itself. Na, 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 na. And you can hear Rey doing the voiceover of, there were stories about what happened. There's something very romantic about Star Wars, and certainly about John Williams' music, right? That's really speaking to John Williams' music, but I mean, those two are so interconnected within Star Wars, it's almost impossible to disconnect the two of them, even though, we have seen Star Wars music done by other composers that's been really good. I mean, I do really enjoy the theme for The Mandalorian. It's grown on me quite a bit, the soundtrack for that. I think that Kiner does a great job with what he's done. I think Giacchino did it, and Powell both did a great job on Rogue One, and especially Solo, a Star Wars story. I love that soundtrack. But they all have those elements of sort of romanticism and large sweeping epics. And romantic and romanticism was a word that I had not used in talking about why, in my opinion, the saga films are so important. For as much as I enjoy the cartoons and the live action content we've seen so far, they're not really sweeping and epic in scope. And I talk a lot about the mythology, but there's that romanticism to it. So much of that is tied into John Williams' music, but they really are sweeping epics. This entire 9-part saga is just that. It's one big space opera epic. And Disney needs that. Lucasfilm needs that. Star Wars needs that. And more specifically, the fans need that. in order to continue to be excited, we need to speculate, and we need the intrigue, and we need the curiosity. And what I'm really had been referring to and hadn't said until I heard that intro, I was like, oh man, it's really romantic. That's the word I'm looking for. We'll get a little bit more into that later on in the show when we talk about box office returns and a thought that the marketing schedule when it comes to live action, we've already seen an example of the impact it could potentially have on box office returns. And I hadn't really thought about it until I read an article from MakingStarWars.net, and it got me, it got this line of thinking going that I wanted to share with you on the show this week. Plus, we'll talk a bit about Palpatine. I arrived at the decision to talk about Palpatine from a rather bizarre non-Star Wars place that I'll share with you in just a moment. But first off, though, let's go to the big story this week, and the thing that really was making headways on Reddit and within the fan community.
The hyperdrive is leaking.
Star Wars Unity and Jeremy Conrad on Twitter posted this particular story on it, at Manabyte on Twitter. Great guy. He does a lot of a Marvel podcast as well. I follow him on Twitter and have notifications on for him because he's really on top of all things Marvel and Star Wars. That when news breaks, he usually tweets it out. But he wrote this story, and it goes like this. For a long time, Star Wars fans have wanted to see a sequel to Solo, a Star Wars story, for many reasons, one of which is how they didn't release the footage for the movie until 3 months before the release. We'll get a little bit more into this, too. The film did underperform at the box office. In the year following that release, Solo has become a real cult favorite, with fans demanding a continuation using the hashtag #MakeSolo2Happen. Back in September, I ran a rumor that I've been hearing that some kind of spin-off of Solo was being planned as a series for Disney+. In the months since then, it sounds like that idea has evolved greatly, with Disney+ being the future of Star Wars for now, and the movies being reserved for something else. That idea of a spin-off of Solo, likely involving crime syndicates or Crimson Dawn and Black Sun, has evolved into a true continuation of where the story left off at the end of the 2018 film. That does mean the same cast who are expected to return. This is likely what Alden Ehrenreich meant recently when he told Esquire, "I've heard some stuff, but nothing concrete about a future of Solo and him playing the part." He was asked specifically about that. Recently, Kessel Run Transmissions reported, and I talked about this last week, that Donald Glover was close to returning to the Lando role. In February, I reported that Disney really wanted to find a way to bring Lando back, and that it sounds like this Solo continuation will set up future Lando series. Recently, there have been rumors flying around the internet about some kind of Darth Maul series on Disney+, but it sounds like those rumors are referring to the Solo continuation. That's expected to feature Maul. The only question up in the air is if Ray Park will be returning to play his body, or if Sam Witwer will do both this time. That's where this whole Disney Plus thing is right now. It started out just as a spin-off about crime syndicates, and it looks to now have evolved into a full continuation. And it's possible, due to fan support of the original movie, much like the hashtag Save Clone Wars campaign that resulted in the 7th season for that show. Darth Maul, Ray Park, who plays the actor for that, he was caught up in a controversy on Instagram, where a very not safe for work private photo, very explicit, was posted on Instagram, quickly taken down. But there's been a lot of speculation that Disney got wind of this and may have removed him from any future Disney projects. Ray Park's wife did come out and apologize to explain it, so I don't know where that ended up, but that's where the one comment came in there. And look, for me personally, just on that particular note, I've got no problem if they recast the role of Darth Maul. To be quite honest with you, I thought that Ray Park looked quite a bit different than the Maul that we saw. He's also quite a bit older. But in Solo, I didn't think he looked the greatest, honestly. There was a promotional shot that was put out of Darth Maul from Solo, and the makeup just seemed weird, and he's older. I would love to see the guy who does the voice, Sam Witwer, play the physical Darth Maul. I mean, the guy's an actor. He's acted before. He's done, for Starkiller in the Force Unleashed series. He already does the voice. And quite honestly, you put Sam in the makeup, and he looks a lot like the Clone Wars character that we've seen in the Clone Wars. So I'd be fine with that. I've got no allegiance to Ray Park. I think he's done a great job as Solo, but if they end up recasting that role, I'm fine with it. All right, so let's double back to the actual rumor in and of itself. It's interesting because Solo the movie did have a bit of what I was talking about at the start of the show, of that romanticism. I really appreciated and love the storyline of Han and Kira, and that's my favorite part of that movie. I'm a hopeless romantic at heart, and I really liked the motivation of Han Solo at the beginning of the film, wanting to get back to her. Something that I could just relate to personally. I really liked the fact that they were split up at the beginning, and that his whole motivation in getting involved with Tobias Beckett was because he wanted to get back to Corellia, because he wanted to find Kira. And then, of course, that whole thing gets complicated once they go on this adventure together. I'm excited about this. I really do like Solo: A Star Wars Story. I think it's a fun film. It's obviously a much smaller film than we've ever gotten on the big screen. I think there's an argument to be made. The Solo: A Star Wars Story perhaps works better on TV, but it is a fantastic movie. If this is a direct continuation, I would be interested in closing the gap in terms of the knowledge we have of Solo leading into A New Hope. So we know that, Han Solo was involved with Jabba the Hutt. Let's see that. We've gone as far as we have already in providing backstories and content related to small things that we were told. I mean, including just the crawl in A New Hope. We got a whole movie out of it. I think it would be pretty rad to be able to go and see Han visit Jabba the Hutt for the first time and get involved in whatever happened that brought about the entire circumstance that we saw in A New Hope. I think that would be great. Seeing the whole cast return, I think, would be spectacular. So I'm really excited about this. Next to a season 2 of The Mandalorian, the Obi-Wan Kenobi and Ahsoka, I mean, this is pretty high on my list of things that I will look forward to if they go and make it official. I mean, this isn't official, but these sources are pretty solid. And I trust that if these guys are making comments like this, and a lot of them are probably getting their information, as I mentioned last week, from Jason Ward from MakingStarWars.net, who's not personally sharing this stuff anymore, then I would think that most likely it's going to happen. And we probably would have gotten wind of it in the next few weeks at Star Wars Celebration, which means that perhaps Disney and Lucasfilm will drop some information in the next few weeks. Nobody's talking about that, but quite honestly, if Lucasfilm and Disney were planning during Celebration, and I finally canceled my Disneyland trip, I finally called the resorts, and they had put out cancellations for the 22nd, until the 22nd, and I was supposed to arrive on the 23rd, so I called up the resorts, and yeah, there's no chance that Disney's going to open anytime this month, and I knew that, but I was still holding out that little teeny tiny bit of hope. But I was heading there because I was going to go to Celebration, which was already canceled, and if they were going to make a bunch of announcements, which I think it's safe to say they were, considering we don't have any movies coming out soon, even with the schedule change, or before the schedule change. We'll probably get confirmation of a lot of this stuff that we've been hearing rumors of. Plus, when it comes to what they can do now with the Volume, which is the new special effects, the new way of special effects that they have, that they've used for The Mandalorian with the massive room with the giant screens, Disney and Lucasfilm really do have an option available now without a green screen to make live-action TV shows that look like the movies. I mean, The Mandalorian looks spectacular. I mean, it just looks fantastic. And to take Solo and do a continuation, I'm sure they're going to end up using that same technology to go and make that happen. So I think that the quality of it will be, just as good as what we would have gotten if they had gone a traditional movie route. As always, what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Love to hear your comments and talk about it on next week's show. For what it's worth, Ron Howard, who took over directing Solo: A Star Wars Story, did come out and say that he had no knowledge of any continuation of Solo, but at the same time, there's an argument to be made that if he's not directing it, why would he? He's not an employee of Lucasfilm, and so he would say, I haven't been asked. And I would imagine if they're doing a Solo continuation, they would probably be tapping into the directors that they've been grooming through The Mandalorian, rather than going with Ron Howard again, who came in as a backup to Lord and Miller. All right, let's go ahead and we will switch gears.
We either fire that'll burn the First Order down.
You know what? I should have used... That wasn't the one I should have used. This is the one I should have used.
When I found you,
Yeah.
I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special.
So, I watched the Harry Potter films over the course of the past week. My wife, Melinda, and our 13-year-old son, Kyle, are huge Harry Potter fans. Arguably, maybe bigger Harry Potter fans than they are Star Wars fans, right? I would say that. If not, they're equal. If not, I think Harry Potter gets the edge with my wife and my 13-year-old son. And so, with summer vacation, doesn't really matter, everyone's distance learning anyways, but with summer vacation going on, they had started watching the Harry Potter films, and so I kind of caught up midstream, and we ended up working through watching a bunch of them last weekend and then into the beginning part of this week. Really enjoyable experience. Probably one of the best experiences that I had watching those films. I'm not the biggest Harry Potter fan. I've never read the books, but I have enjoyed the movies. I had a new level of appreciation watching these films this time around. I think it's largely due to the fact that I'm 20,000 words into the book 5 in the timeline, which will start the next trilogy in my own EMBARK saga. Book 4, that's being edited right now, that should be out in September, is a smaller, more intimate story involving one character from an event that takes place in Book 3, The Vanishing War, which is all available at mynerdworld.net. So when we get into Book 5 is going to be another very large and epic beginning to a trilogy, which may end up completing the entire EMBARK series. 7 books is kind of what I have in mind. Depending on its success, I may go further. I really enjoy playing within this universe. That being said, watching these Harry Potter films and just being in the middle of the creative process, I was really getting into the storytelling. And, there's a lot of eye rolls for me. I try to write my stories as such to have them make as much sense as possible and not have points of plot convenience. And Harry Potter's got a lot of points of plot convenience. It cracks me up, especially when Harry will walk into Dumbledore's abode, and suddenly the door, this closet will open and this cauldron will be there in exactly the right moment, right when Harry needed it. It's so convenient, right? It's movie time. It doesn't bother me. I just find it amusing. But I'm watching these films, and a couple of things sprung to mind. And I'm actually going to change my tune on a particular stance that I've had for a long, long time after watching the films. Because I want to get into Voldemort more specifically and then get to Palpatine. We'll just spend a minute talking about Harry Potter. I know it's a Star Wars podcast, but the one thing that I really did enjoy about watching the Potter films is that I know they had different directors, but there was definitely a vibe that carries through those entire films, and they're very cohesive in terms of how they look. The only outliers, in my opinion, and I think there's probably hardcore Potter fans that would agree with me, but as a casual Potter fan, the only outliers in that group are the first 2, Sorcerer's Stone and Chamber of Secrets. Those films don't necessarily have the same type of tonal darkness and, to a certain extent, grittiness that the rest of the films do. That being said, they do all flow very nicely. From 3 on, it reminds me quite a bit of the sequel trilogy. In my opinion, the sequel trilogy, among the 3 trilogies in Star Wars, the sequel trilogy is the one that is the most visually and musically cohesive, but certainly visually. There's a musical cohesion to all of them. But, Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith, they all just flow great from a visual standpoint. Then you have the original trilogy, which also does, but there are some pretty big jumps, right? A lot of it's just due to technology of the time. Star Wars: A New Hope in and of itself is unique, coming out in 1977 and the limitations of technology. George did a good job, in my opinion, of the special editions, but then you get into The Empire Strikes Back, and we do have a broader movie. It's bigger in scope. You're going to more planets. Cinematography is a little bit different. And then, in my opinion, in Return of the Jedi, we kind of revert a little bit, right? It's not as cohesive. The sequel trilogy would have been if it wasn't for Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi in the middle. It's not a complaint. It's just a reality. J.J. Abrams' films have a very distinctive look. But to be quite honest with you, you could put The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker next to Star Trek, the 2009 and Into Darkness, and they look visually. There's more in common with those films than there is with J.J. Abrams' The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker than there is with The Last Jedi. They're just visually very, very different. Okay, so why am I going off on this long tangent? I'm going off on this long tangent for two different reasons. The first off is I hope that Disney and Lucasfilm, when they give us the next set of saga movies, does find a way to make it look visually the same. That's just my opinion. I like that. There is a certain level of one of these things is not like the other that I personally get, even though I love The Last Jedi. If you watch these in order and you go from The Force Awakens to The Last Jedi, there's a part of it where it's very recognizable. This is shot very differently in a very different film. And look, I back away far enough. None of it is taking away from my enjoyment of these movies. And this is just, I'm getting into real minutia. That's what we do here on podcasts. So, watching the Harry Potter films, that's the first thing that came to mind was, okay, these are really good examples of, even though there were books beforehand, the mythology that carries all these characters through is really, really important. And it's a very long story that needs to be told, and should be seen on the big screen. Okay. All right. The second part is having J.K. Rowling having already written all these books, from a story-wise perspective, you had one person telling all of it. And I've never personally had an issue with different directors coming in and writing these films, right? I understand a little bit better what people mean when it comes to the sequel trilogy, even though I don't have necessarily a problem with the way that story plays out. I love the sequel trilogy. It's my favorite of the trilogies right now. I can definitely see the perspective that some people have coming in about having different directors take over. And my takeaway now with regard to that is not so much directors, but it's a central storyteller that's driving the main plot points. That's the difference between the sequel trilogy and the original trilogy, and certainly the prequel trilogy. The prequel trilogy was all George. So he wrote all those, he directed all of those, so they're going to have that cohesion, right? The original trilogy, George was in charge of the plot, some of the script writing, but he handed it off to different directors. But you still had one guy in charge at its core. We get into the sequel trilogy, and now you're dealing with, in the end, two different visionaries telling their story as a continuation of the other. You have a story group in the center, but the story group isn't there to go and provide plotting. The story group is just there to make sure that everything kind of fits and matches. So, I do kind of agree now, where I hadn't before, with some of the complaints of the sequel trilogy. I don't want to see a change, and I am totally fine with what we got, but I certainly see the merits of the people that criticize that there should have been a more cohesion in terms of who was driving the overall story. I would also like to see the next batch of films be done by one person. That's what this whole long thing is about. Watching those Harry Potter films, even though we had a bunch of different directors, David Yates took over and finished out those films and did the Fantastic Beasts movies, which also fit very well from a visual and storytelling standpoint into the Harry Potter films. I really hope that Disney and Lucasfilm doesn't go the route on whatever the long saga is going to be, right? We're going to get side stories. I think Taika Waititi's story is probably going to be a side story. Kevin Feige's movie, probably going to be a side story. If Rian Johnson comes in with his trilogy of stories, then I hope that he is the one to map out, even if we have different directors, that he is the one to go and map out exactly what is going to happen within however many movies they decide for that saga. The other thing that stuck out to me was the villain in Voldemort, and it really got me thinking about Palpatine. Okay. And the genius that is Palpatine, and having Palpatine and Rey in the final battle in The Rise of Skywalker, I really do think in retrospect was a masterstroke. Snoke is the oddball here, right? But in retrospect, I view Snoke as Palpatine taking his rule of two idea to the next level. Or the other way to look at it is you go back and watch the other films, and he never took his apprentices to that level. Dooku, Maul, Grievous, Vader to a certain extent, right? Watching The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi now, I really enjoy looking at Snoke from the standpoint of, okay, he's really just, he created him. Palpatine was very weak, but really he's just his apprentice who he put out there in his stead, as opposed to having him by his side. And I dig that. I think that's a really brilliant way, even if that wasn't necessarily the intention from the get-go. I think it was a really brilliant way to bring in a new Palpatine-like character that wasn't necessarily as repetitive as just having Palpatine again and then introducing Palpatine at the end in The Rise of Skywalker, only to find out that really he was a creation of Palpatine who is essentially an apprentice that he decided to put as the face of the First Order, since he was not powerful enough to do it in and of himself because of what had happened in Return of the Jedi, and because he was in his weakened state in his own decrepit clone body. Going back to Palpatine from the beginning, I've thought about this a lot and haven't mentioned it on the show, but when you look at these 9 films, we know it's the story of the Skywalkers, but let's be honest, it's the story about Palpatine too. And that's why I really enjoy the fact that Rey ended up being a Palpatine. And I think that Palpatine makes for a really great bad guy. He makes for a really great bad guy because we know his motivation. And that's why the prequels are so important. I really do think that Star Wars and Star Wars fans for years to come, and maybe in this gap between now and 2023 and, 2022, when we end up finding out what this next film is going to be, because that will hopefully spark the intrigue and the curiosity, right? I really do hope and perhaps expect that the fandom may start looking as a whole at all 9 films again, in the absence of having anything larger to talk about beyond whatever content we're getting on Disney Plus. Because when you do look at it as a whole, that Palpatine story is really cool. Because we get something that we don't normally get. Like when we got the original trilogy, Palpatine ended up, we got a glimpse of him as a hologram in The Empire Strikes Back, and then he shows up in Return of the Jedi, but there's all this mystery behind him. And I'm cool with that, and I was cool with that as a kid. I think it's great. You don't necessarily need to know what's going on with him. He's already taken over the galaxy. How did he get there? But the prequel trilogy and seeing Palpatine and his rise to power really was a fantastic bit of storytelling on George Lucas's part, because it is clear what Palpatine's motivation is. As a radio talk show host, we've been talking about this type of concept of villains and dictators and bad people a lot on the show. As a matter of fact, I even invoked Kylo Ren and the comment that Adam Driver made about how Kylo Ren was not sort of your mustache-twirling villain, but he was more of an individual who thought what he was doing was right. He felt self-righteous in his motivation of what he was trying to do. He didn't think what he was doing was wrong, and I think that to a certain extent, Palpatine feels that as well. He's tapped into the dark side. He created this scenario to bring himself to power, but ultimately, he created this Clone Wars conflict so he can end it and bring peace so he can stay in power. His motivation is clear. The dude just wants to rule everything. Some people are just like that. They feel like they know better than everybody else. And you give them a little bit of power and they refuse to go and relinquish it. He's a really powerful villain. And I like the fact that when they did the sequel trilogy, they didn't just immediately go back to him. They put in the sort of mystery character of Snoke and got us all talking about it, only to hit us upside the head in The Rise of Skywalker. And I think J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio did a masterful job of bringing him back. Didn't necessarily need to explain exactly or see exactly how he transferred his essence from when he got thrown down the shaft to a clone body. We ended up getting that in ancillary material. But it makes sense that here's Palpatine all this time. He survives it. He's got a contingency plan in place. He puts himself in a clone body. That clone body is decrepit. And here is a granddaughter of his that is powerful in the Force. And now he is going to try to do what he was unable to do in Return of the Jedi, and he has an offspring, and he thinks that his offspring, being his bloodline, is going to have the same effect with him that it had on Luke and Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi. You have no family here but me, Palpatine says at the end. And yet, it's his own undoing hubris and arrogance that ends up ultimately being his downfall when Rey, ends up bringing in all the Jedi, representation of all the Jedi, and takes them out. I think it's brilliant in my opinion. At a bare minimum, it totally works within the larger scope. Because I think Voldemort's a really good character, a really good villain. You know his motivation. Why is he doing the things that he is? Harry Potter gets way too convoluted for me personally. Okay, I haven't read the books, but it just gets really, really confusing. I like Star Wars for its mythology, and while there's depth there is a level of accessibility to it that makes it really easily understandable and motivations easier to believe and get into. And Palpatine, to me, is just one of the ultimate villains, and what they did with The Rise of Skywalker and bringing him back, I really thought was a masterstroke in bringing all these movies together as one. It really does tie them all. It does tie them all in. Lucasfilm and whoever directs whatever the next saga series of films is going to be is going to have a tough road ahead because they're going to need something like that. They're going to have to start fresh and try to find some type of threat that isn't necessarily derivative, or certainly not bringing anybody back, that isn't derivative of what's come before. I trust in the content creators that they'll figure this out, and I'm really excited to see what they end up giving us in the end. One more last point on this, and I'll just use my own personal creative process as the example. But getting back to the idea of having one person driving the story among multiple films, even if we do have other directors, that really does afford the opportunity in my mind to have a little bit more fun with plot elements that you can go and play with later on. And this is something that I've done within my books where I've planted little seeds here and there, and then I really look forward to getting into further storytelling to have those little seeds that were planted pay off in big ways. I mean, that's what the whole fourth book in my series is about. I have an event that takes place that's minor to the overall story of what happens in the Vanishing War, but that minor story and that minor little plot element ended up becoming its own separate book, and I love doing that. And I think there's a better opportunity for, when it comes to content creation, if there is one person, not a story group sort of saying, hey, you're good doing that, you're good doing that, but one individual who has the plot points that he can lay out to hand to writers to go and tell the stories that they want to tell. There was a little bit of that. We know that there was a little bit of that with Rey and with Ben Solo, Kylo Ren, that there was an arc there. But I do think that one core individual like a George Lucas type could definitely do a better job.
This is not going to go
even though I love the sequel trilogy
the way you think.
All right, one more quick little diversion here on the show this week, and I just had I read a line and it got me thinking, and I wanted to share it with you on the show. I was reading an article on MakingStarWars.net, and Jason Ward made a comment that he felt that Mandalorian impacted the box office for The Rise of Skywalker. And I had not really thought about that. And I actually think there's some truth to that. There's a lot of variables involved, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to sort of hot take the release schedules and the impact that they have on the other content. Star Wars thrived right up until after The Last Jedi. Okay. And I know people will point to The Last Jedi and how divisive it was that shifted everything. I don't believe that's necessarily the case. I am still of the opinion that when it comes to the divisiveness over The Last Jedi, that is a byproduct of some of the loudest, small in size minority voices complaining, and not necessarily representative of the overall public at large. You don't get to the box office that The Last Jedi got and the success that it had and the Blu-ray sales without a large majority of fans really liking that movie. Okay, so what changed after that going into The Rise of Skywalker? Well, we ended up getting a lot of content. As Jeremy said in his article, we didn't get any footage for Solo until 3 months before its release, 6 months, and the movie came out 6 months after The Last Jedi. Disney, I don't think, and Lucasfilm had any idea, how would you know, what The Last Jedi was going to do in terms of fandom and the way that everybody talked about that film. And I think a part of the reason why the Rise of Skywalker didn't perform completely up to what people had thought for being the last film in the series is that we did have an abundance of content. The initial footage for Solo wasn't all that compelling. The teaser that came out for Solo was kind of meh. The trailer that came out for Solo was good, but what was it lacking? And this is just my opinion. It was lacking that thing that I talked about at the start of the show. It was lacking the intrigue. It was lacking the mystery. It was lacking the sweeping, epic romanticism that we've come to know with Star Wars. Compare the marketing to Solo. Now, granted, it's not a movie about that. But Star Wars has always been about that. And when it comes to the big screen, I think there was, even on a subconscious level, an expectation from the audience of what Star Wars was supposed to be. But everybody was so still caught up with talking about The Last Jedi that you release footage for Solo, and while everybody, good or bad, is like, what's going on with Rey? What's happening with Reylo? What did Rian Johnson do to Luke Skywalker? And then they present this Solo, and everybody's kind of like, oh, okay, I don't know. I'm really confused about this other movie, and I got a lot of thoughts about it. And it does go back to the chief complaint, and that is they should have had Solo release at the end of the year. Or wait for Disney+. But ultimately, I think Solo would have benefited, as would had The Rise of Skywalker, if Solo had been released at a better date and had a better run-up. I think what Solo needed was a better campaign and a better marketing campaign leading up to it that was more indicative of what the movie was going to be. The trailers were indicative of what the movies were going to be, but I think they could have lightened it up even more to give everybody a better sense and idea and a lead up and try to create a little bit of intrigue, right? Look, it might not have been a bad idea for the marketing team, for as much as they wanted the surprise of Darth Maul, spoiler alert, in Solo. That would have been something that if they had actually dropped, I think would have brought more people to the theater if they had done that and let everybody kind of speculate and then wait and then pushed it until December. Okay, so we all know that for whatever reason, Solo didn't do well because ultimately it was just too close to The Last Jedi. And I think that it being too close to The Last Jedi not only hurt Solo, but I think it ultimately ended up hurting The Rise of Skywalker, because the fandom could have worked through a lot of their problems. Because I think a lot of those problems that people had in the discussions around The Last Jedi took a bit of a back seat for a little while when Solo came out, and then everybody ended up returning right back to it again. But then what happened? Everybody's talking and speculating. What is J.J. Abrams going to do? What's going to happen with Reylo? And then we get Mandalorian. And Mandalorian is, arguably loved by all the fans. There's no complaining about The Mandalorian. People are into it. But now everybody's attention is watching The Mandalorian on TV. And what's happening? They're getting their Star Wars. Star Wars works when people are deprived of it. It just does. Right? When we're clamoring for it. I really think that 2023 movie has the potential to be huge because they're putting such a big gap in the films. But let's be honest here. If you're getting a bunch of great Star Wars, especially fans that didn't like The Last Jedi, and you're seeing that on TV, and you're getting this Mandalorian show that you're really, really into, suddenly now The Rise of Skywalker, you don't need it. I do as a fan, but I think a lot of fans were like, I got Mandalorian, man. I don't need to go and see The Rise of Skywalker right away. I can wait and watch it later. I think Disney and Lucasfilm knows all this, and I think it's probably why they were fine pushing that other saga film to 2023. I'll be very interested to see how Disney handles all this moving forward. I'm of the opinion that because of what we're dealing with in the world right now, we're going to get a lot of animated content, right? Because it's one of the few things you can work on in the middle of a pandemic. So there's probably, if that Rebels rumor is coming true, that's being worked on. We know the Bad Batch is being worked on. But we're going to get a lot of live action content. But I'm going to venture a guess that when we get to the latter part of 2022 and we know what the 2023 movie is going to be, that the live-action Disney Plus stuff, if we get anything in 2022, it'll happen at the beginning part of the year, but that they'll clear the air and get everybody ready for a 2023 movie. All right, so that's a whole lot of unsubstantiated hot takes from your host, but I'd love to hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. What do you think? Am I full of it? Do you agree with any of it? What are your thoughts on everything that I just laid out? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, our first listener feedback comes from Jay Stickles, friend of the show. Says, I'm so glad I'm not the only one who thinks that Corey and Noah's sources are just Jason Ward and his sources. Yeah, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I talked about this at length last week, in my opinion, that Jason Ward, who's been canceled for the most part, who was really the chief leaker of Star Wars stuff, he's got all the great sources, is no longer leaking stuff on his own, and I'm convinced that he's handing it off to the individuals who've been leaking most of the stuff as of late. So, good. I'm glad you agree with me. I had fun talking about that last week. All right, let's go to a friend of the show, Miranda, who says this. The only thing I can say right now, to be on the safe side, because I don't want to pretend I can predict the future, because I can't, but these next 3 years, in terms of the length of this time gap, something tells me that we're going to be in a very different place mentally. We're going to feel different about things than we are now. Some parts of the fandom might grow, some might calm down, and a handful may still be the same as they are today or a year ago. I don't know what's going to happen. It's a little scary to me and unsettling, and I accept that. I'm not afraid to admit I'm scared of the unknown, but something tells me whatever is going or set to be released in the year 2023, I believe, when the time comes to bring out the first teaser, it's going to feel like it never left Star Wars. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. For some reason, and we'll see if this still rings true, for some reason, when it comes to the fandom, they've been really sort of hands-off on anything that's not... Now, granted, we've only got The Mandalorian, right? But we do have Rebels and Clone Wars and Resistance, right? The fandom's been really sort of hands-off of overly criticizing that, and they've really... We'll see if that continues. But for some reason, I just feel like the live-action TV show stuff is going to get a pass from a lot of the fandom menace types. And 3 years is a long way for the next saga film for those individuals out there to still be holding a grudge. So we'll see what happens. But as always, Miranda, friend of the show, I appreciate it. Last one today comes from Brennan Marr, right? From the podcast Page Turners, They Are Not. I was recently thinking about the comparisons I see between the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy in terms of audience and fan reactions. I see the comparisons this way. Both A New Hope and The Force Awakens are fairly straightforward, MacGuffin-driven adventures that introduce new characters and a great new world, as well as get the audience locked in and enjoying this new direction. Both The Empire Strikes Back and The Last Jedi serve to take the story in a deeper and darker direction, as well as challenge the audience with audacious artistic choices. Fans resist at first, with reviews showing a division, but many come to accept it and love it as perhaps the best film in their respective trilogies. Return of the Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker serve to wrap up the trilogies and become the films that are most divisive among fans as they introduce ideas and concepts that are not necessarily well received by many. It's my theory that the final installments of these trilogies will remain somewhat divisive as years go on. I do believe that all three films in the sequel trilogy will be loved in the years to come, but these are just a few comparisons I see between the movies. What do you think? No, Brandon, that's a really good analogy, and I think it's pretty spot on. It really is just the nature of storytelling. And again, I know I keep going back to this, but I've been writing books, and I wrote a trilogy, and I'm in the process of writing a new one, and it really just is sort of the nature of telling a story. You know, you got to kick things off. You got to set the stage in the first book or movie, and then in the middle chapter, everything's supposed to go to hell in a handbasket. We have to, get our characters into difficult spots so that we can set up for the big finale. That's exactly what I did in the EMBARK trilogy, and the same thing happened in all three of these trilogies. They're really good. I mean, like I said, watching the Harry Potter films is a different beast. And we've kind of been going through trilogies. Like, we watched Lord of the Rings as of late, too. But see, I like the villains that we see, like with Palpatine, more than I like the villains, say, in Lord of the Rings. That motivation and what Lucas did with Palpatine, again, going back to the prequels and seeing him early before he completely reveals himself, when he's just the Phantom Menace. And you go back to the Phantom Menace now and watch that movie for me, and it just takes on so much more meaning, knowing where we're going and knowing how much is going to happen between now and that just incredible moment at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. My gosh, I just love that film. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Star Wars Kids put out a really fun video. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long. I forgot to mention at the start of the show, but if you listen to the show, I love vehicles. I love spaceships. They put out a video where they run through and label almost all the spaceships and vehicles from the sequel trilogy, including the Battle of Exegol. There's been a couple of Twitter accounts that have been talking about this today, and I'll tell you what, it's pretty cool. Just from a vehicle fan, it's really, really neat. It goes really fast. You got to kind of pause it if you're into that kind of stuff to look at the names and all that. But definitely go and check that out at YouTube, youtube.com. All right, last thing before we go. Remember, mynerdworld.net, or go to amazon.com and look for Jon, Jon Justice. And if you happen to be new to the show, I am an author. I've written a science fiction space opera series, set in the future, where air and spaceflight culture has replaced car culture. All Taft, our hero, wanted to do was impress the girl that he longed to be with, Katha. He did not expect or plan that he was going to have to save the world in the process. Right? 8 billion people living on Earth suddenly forced to evacuate, and their only escape is outer space. I was inspired by George Lucas and the science fiction books and films of my youth, and wrote this trilogy in honor of that. The reviews have been great, and a lot of that's because of your support. So if this is the first time listening to the show, and you like sci-fi, or it's sci-fi, and you've enjoyed what you've heard, you can support the show by picking up a copy of the book. Again, mynerdworld.net or Amazon. You can pick up the ebooks for all 3 books. Right now, you can get EMBARK Book 1, the ebook, for just 99 cents. And then Book 2, Treasure in Darkness, and Book 3, The Vanishing War, are both available for $3.99. Purchase of the ebook will get you a discount on the audiobook for any one of the 3 stories, and all 3 audiobooks are now available, as are the paperbacks. There's a brand new cover for Book 1, including all 5 of our main characters, Taft, Katha, Ven, Jabet, and Ashley. They now adorn the Book 1 cover, and they're all available now in matte finish. So, check out the new cover if you haven't seen it already. If you have the original one, you've got a collector's item. Maybe you want to pick up another copy to get the new cover. Again, all available at mynerdworld.net, and it is the only way and the way that you can support the show. If you've purchased a copy of the books already, please go and leave me a review. Really would mean a lot to me. I need all the reviews I can get on Amazon.com. That helps with future sales. And maybe while you're there, if you already have picked up a copy, gift a copy to a friend. Right there on the homepage at Amazon.com, there is a little window where it says, hey, you can gift a book to a friend, and email them right to it. Really would appreciate the support as I continue my journey at being an author. I am an author now. I've written 3 books. The next book is coming out in September. Again, it's a spinoff story based off of what happens in the Vanishing War. And then Book 5, it's going to be so good. I'm in the middle of writing it right now, and I've got a new... I have a character. We're jumping ahead in the timeline about 11 years, and I got a character that'll be the protagonist of this, and I am having such a ball writing this character. I don't want to give anything away. But you can get more details again at mynerdworld.net. I think that wraps it up. Email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Mailing list, that's the last thing. If you want to get on the mailing list, I don't sell your stuff. I don't share it with anybody. I just email about the podcast and more specifically the books and deals when they're available, including free audiobooks. If you go to mynerdworld.net and look at the My Nerd blog, if you haven't got yourself a free audiobook, you might be able to find a code that hasn't been used. But if you want to be on the mailing list, I'm growing it every week, and I hope to grow it even more. So email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and just say, hey, John, put me on the mailing list, and I will do that. All right, that wraps things up. I'll be back again next week. Be safe, be healthy, be happy. Watch some Star Wars. That's what I do, man. Puts me in a good mood every single time. I'll talk to you guys again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.